Hey, Geoff, have you ever been to a fair? I'm thinking maybe a county fair or state fair.
I have actually. I've been to a number of fairs. There's a couple down in LA where I was sort of raised, the LA County Fair, and then the Orange County Fair that I've been to as well, though not as often because I lived in LA. And it's a fun experience. You sort of go around, you get, some fried food, which is always really good. There's like usually some sort of like exhibits, typically, if I remember correctly, which I always thought was weird because I was in the heart of LA. But there's usually like farm animals that you can sort of go over and see and pet. And then, of course, there's the rides, right? There's the Ferris wheel, there's the zipper, and there's all of these rides are, in my opinion, of dubious quality.
Right. Yeah.
I don't.
There's a bunch of bolts laying on the ground underneath that you're sort of concerned about, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And they're just like whipping people in the air and just spinning them around. And I'm like, as a kid, I was like, ooh, fun. Now I'm like, ooh, I kind of want to live. But yeah, that's my general experience with fairs.
Well, we're going to be talking about fairs today, but we're not going to be talking about those kinds of fairs, although there's maybe a few similarities. The fairs that we're going to be talking about today are World's Fairs.
Okay. I mean, I guess I don't know exactly the evolution. Maybe we'll go through that today, but county fairs, I don't know when they started, but it could have just been like a spinoff of these old sort of mega fairs that countries and cities would put on in the past, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, this would be the history of fairs more generally, right? Because there have been fairs for hundreds and thousands of years probably around the world as well. But the kind of fairs that we're talking about, these world fairs, is a bit more of a modern thing. And by modern, I mean in the industrial age. These things are sometimes called world's fairs. That's what we generally call them in the United States. Universal exhibitions, that's more of the French term. And then expositions or expos is used pretty widely as well. So we can use these interchangeably.
Because as you're saying this, like here in Portland, we have like something called the Expo Center, right? That's right. This is a place that is, I guess, in theory, used for events sort of like what you sort of already described, sort of showcasing something, expositioning something. And it's interesting thinking about, well, what's like, how's that like that connection been made through history?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about is the largest fairs basically that have happened. And these are large temporary exhibitions hosted by a city, but sort of by a country as well for up to 6 months. So,
wow.
It's something that runs for a while. So people have time to travel and get there, and it's ongoing. There were precursors to this type of events, as we just sort of mentioned, but the first modern World's Fair took place in London in 1851. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But so we're dating this back to 1851, this kind of stuff that we're talking about. And today there's two basic categories of these fairs. There's World Expos, which are the biggest ones. So they're very large events. They have broad themes. I think they last longer, more time, and they cost an enormous amount to stage. And then there's something else called specialized expos, which are a little bit smaller. It may run for a shorter period of time, have much more specific targeted themes, and cost less. Still a lot, but less than the biggest ones. Sometimes it's hard to know which one is which, right? Because we sometimes talk about them as if they're the same thing.
Right. This is actually making me think of, there's this book that I read not that long ago called, I think, Devil in the White City. Have you heard about this book?
Yes.
So it's a weird book because it's like half about this sort of serial killer stuff, which whatever. And then the other half is sort of like urban planning, specifically focused around Chicago and I think the World's Fair that they're planning for that city at the time.
That would have been 1893, I think. And we'll talk about that fair a little bit. But yeah, I was talking to a friend yesterday who mentioned that same book, that same phrase. Yeah. And we'll come to probably the origin of that too, which is one of the much more nefarious aspects of World's Fairs. And, like all aspects of culture, that there's usually the good and the ugly side of things as well.
Yep.
these and the themes I'll be giving examples of throughout, because the themes are kind of interesting to think about and talk about.
I can only imagine.
And you'll see what I mean, I think, in a moment. But Geoff, let me ask you this. Why do you think that these things even happen in the first place? Why have World's Fairs?
Yeah, I've thought a little bit about this, because in some ways it kind of parallels to me the Olympics, in that,
okay,
and not that these,
which I can't believe we haven't done an episode on yet.
Right, I know, right? But
that's got to be coming.
It's got to come, yeah, soon. But just in that the World's Fairs, I think, were happening at a certain period of time when there was, I think, for lack of a better term, a lot of cultural competition going on between not just countries, but also cities within countries. And there was a lot of sort of, quote unquote boosters, these probably very wealthy people within each of these places, states, cities, countries, that had this, during this period of time, this ego where they really wanted to sort of prop up and showcase sort of their area and sort of showcase how wonderful and sort of, magnanimous their culture was. And, as compared to, certainly if you're here in the United States, as a sort of at that point of time, an up and coming country wanting to show, the colonial powers that be at the time in Europe that, hey, United States is a big deal and we have the culture to match and we have the money and prominence to match, and the, maybe even technological innovation to match as well, if it's sort of floating into that exposition-y side. That's sort of my broad-based answer there.
I would say that all pretty much rings true with what I've been reading about, what I've been researching, that's a really big part of it, to showcase a city, but also a country as very forward-looking, on the cutting edge of technology and business and industry. And so those things all figure, and you have some individuals who are boosters of the city or of the country who are really promoting this in a strong way. That all holds up. Even more specifically, I think that there's this running theme throughout most of these to promote or display particular ideas or narratives about progress. What is and of course, progress, that's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And it can mean a lot of different things, but that seems to be wrapped up in a lot of these kinds of these fairs, these expos. Developing trade further is certainly one of the goals, that promoting the open for businessness of some countries and cities is part of this as well. Developing economic opportunities in the countries and in the cities where they are held is part of the motivation, has to be part of the motivation. Bolstering city and national pride, which is something that you talked about, is definitely a huge motivation. And more recently, we might talk about it as an effort to promote public diplomacy. Are you familiar with what public diplomacy is?
I mean, if I could, I'm not super familiar with it. I would guess that it's probably trying to use public opinion in order to shift sort of global diplomacy in some way. I don't know how that works, so I'm not a politician at all.
Yeah, no, it's like that. Although it's efforts from a state government to communicate directly to groups and citizens of other countries. So not from government to government, from government to a whole group of people or something like that. So it's an effort to, it involves propaganda via various forms of media to promote the political goals of a particular country. You might think of it as the public relations for a government.
Interesting. That kind of, so a couple weeks back, or maybe 3 weeks back now, we did an episode on Catalonia independence movement. At that point, you had mentioned that during the Barcelona Olympics, the Catalonia government or some sort of entity.
That's right, the regional government.
Page in the New York Times in order to, if that sort of rings the same sort of idea. They're sort of using
That's exactly public diplomacy. Absolutely. It's the idea of pitching to a whole different group of people, bypassing the government at that moment and saying, hey, this is how you should understand this particular place. Barcelona is not a city in Spain. Barcelona is a city in Catalonia.
Right.
And so that's a really good example of that. Sharing information about and promoting new technologies is a big part of this as well. And, you think that these things are happening when they first started, not only before the internet, but before television, before radio, before movies. So this is a way of sort of announcing to people what's happening technologically and what's happening in different parts of the world. So part of this is sharing information to promote ideas about cultures and places throughout the world. Oftentimes, countries will set up pavilions to promote their own country at a World's Fair that's being held somewhere else. However, in some cases, and we'll get to this in the second part, the host country will create a display about other places in the world. And these depictions are often very far from positive. So, it's trying to shape people's impressions of different parts of the world.
That's interesting, especially the sort of sharing information or showcasing different sort of things, because it's almost like, I'm thinking of, there's like an annual conference in like Las Vegas or something called Consumer Electronics Expo. I don't know, something like that.
Right.
And like that's the same idea. Now it's granted it's no longer tied to a governing entity of sorts. I mean, it's always based in Las Vegas, and there's a reason for that. But it's almost funny thinking like, oh, that was these world fairs before, and maybe that's one of the evolutions of this, right? We already talked about maybe the evolution, heading into the country fair or county fair, model. Maybe another evolution is like, hey, that's actually where some of these trade shows, these expositions of different things, also came out of this time. I
think that sounds like what I've been reading about a little bit too. And when we get to the finale part of the episode, we'll revisit this idea a little bit and talk about it some more. I've read in a few different sources that there's a sort of a guideline for thinking historically about the different eras in which these world fairs fall into. So showcasing industrialization from 1851, which is the first one, into the 1930s, right? So pre-World War II. And then showcasing cultural exchange from around that time, pre-World War II, 1939 to into the late 80s, and then showcasing nation branding subsequent to that. Now, in my own view, these eras really bleed into one another. And so thinking about them too rigidly along these demarcations is probably making too stark a categorization about it. That's a rough way to think about it. But in my mind, these fairs kind of many of them fulfill most of those sort of focuses, right? The industrialization, cultural exchange, and nation building. And then lastly, not lastly, there's other things we could say, but that expos are also a way for large corporations to promote their products and their services as well. And that's part of the business part. So let's talk a little bit about where these things have been held. Historically, most world fairs have been held in a small number of European countries. Paris has had a bunch. Mm-hmm. In the country of Belgium, there's been several. London has had some. And some were held in the United States as well. But more recently, there's been a pretty discernible change in the geography of these expos. And most of the recent expos have been held in Asia. So, for example, the most recent World Expo, by which I mean the big ones, was held in Dubai in 2020. Actually, it was supposed to be in 2020, but it was held in 2021 because of COVID, many other things. And the theme, here's the first theme here, connecting minds, creating the future. And the expo involved the participation of 192 countries, which is about the number the United Nations recognizes, I think, which is the most ever for a World's Fair. Now, there was supposed to be a World's Fair in 2023 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. However, the city backed out, and there doesn't seem to be any rescheduling date or anything for the city to host that. I'm not 100% sure why, but I know that Argentina has struggled with economic up and downs for the last several decades. So perhaps that's part of what went on, or maybe it's something else that I should be aware of that I'm not. So the next big expo is going to be in 2025, and that will be held in Osaka, Japan from April to October with the theme Designing Future Society for Our Lives. And Osaka beat out 4 other bids, right? I mean, it's not over, right? They go along these lines. Osaka's actually subsequently, previously has held one of these in 1970, where the theme at that point was progress and harmony for mankind. So wide open, and we wouldn't say mankind probably today; we'd say humankind. Osaka beat 4 other cities who were bidding for this right to host this expo. One was Baku, Azerbaijan, who wanted the theme human capital. Paris, France, which has hosted a bunch and ended up withdrawing its bid. The operating theme there was sharing our knowledge and caring for the planet.
I think
for some reason I think
Baku's theme, human capital, is something that's not probably looked on as favorably these days in terms of what that word means.
Yeah, maybe there's something lost in the translation when you translate things from language to language. But yeah, you'll notice a progression in these themes where they're the kind of themes that we would find a little bit more problematic probably in the past. And now they're this wide open sort of, progress for harmony in humankind, we could say, designing future society for our lives. I mean, that could be a lot of things. Like this is a wide tent, right? A pretty wide open theme. Expo 2023, they've already found a location for this one as well. And that's going to run from 2030. I keep messing up my dates here.
That's all right.
Expo 2030 will run from October 2030 to April 2031 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And the theme of this expo will be the era of change together for a foresighted tomorrow.
All these themes are just like, it's like a word jumble, word salad, right? It's just like throw like progress and happy and I guess, tomorrow and change and planet in there and just see what comes up.
It seems like there should be a random World's Fair name generator online someplace that you can just plug in some things. This also sounds very much like a committee put this title together, this theme together. It's like, well, this is our compromise title and it says just about everything. So a few notes on some of the specialized expos. There was one in 2017 held in Astana, Kazakhstan. And the theme, again, these themes are a little bit more specific. Future energy was the theme for that one. The next specialized expo will be held in Belgrade, Serbia, with the theme Play for Humanity, Sport and Music for All. Pretty specific, somewhat specific.
Yeah, I would say so.
Peace for Humanity.
It's got a theme for sure.
That's right, yeah. And so we'll see that with some of these more specialized ones. There's a lot more to talk about in terms of places where these have been held, but I feel like we're coming upon perhaps our first break.
We are, yes. So I have one quick comment before we do, and that is, yes. I don't know if this is just, me being, centered here in the United States, but I had always thought that World's Fairs were something of the past. I did not know this was something that was still going on. So this has actually been very surprising.
I think you're probably not alone in thinking that, particularly from people in the United States, because we haven't had them here for a few decades.
Yeah.
Are those still going on? And the answer is they are still going on, and they're drawing more and more people.
Incredible.
And again, Asia it was just a big place, but various locations in Asia have been hosting these, and Europe a little bit, but North America not as much.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that as well.
All right. Well, let's jump to our first ad break, and we'll be right back.
We're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about geography as world fairs or world expos. And we've been talking a little bit about where some of the most recent ones have happened and are going to be happening. But let's go way back for a second. I mentioned that the first one was in 1851. This was in London. And the event was billed as the Great Exhibition of the Works of All Nations. So that's pretty all-encompassing.
These words,
not sure it's an accurate title.
Yeah, these word salads have been. This is like a historic precedent here.
Oh yeah, this starts from the very beginning, right? That's not a new thing. It's sometimes called. They have shorthand names for these. The Great Exhibition for short, because that's a mouthful, right? To say all that. And the industry of all nations was clearly the theme. And in part, it was meant to assuage the fears of the general public and of people about industrialization. So if you think about 1851, that's maybe 100 years or less into the era of industrialization. Many parts of the world have not been industrialized, but England is the first place to industrialize. Not so much London, but the Midlands. But so here's an effort to kind of make this palatable for people and explain what's going on and make it perhaps have more public support in some way. The exhibition was held in an enormous glass and cast iron structure that was built explicitly for the event called Crystal Palace. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of the team Crystal Palace FC.
I knew you were going to say that.
Is that based on this Crystal Palace?
I believe it is. It is. It was an enormous structure, very impressive. And the idea was to highlight the strength and glory of the British Empire. The structure was relocated to a different part of London after 3 years. However, it was destroyed by a fire in 1936. So this is not one of the things that remains. In fact, for most world fairs, most of the buildings don't remain anymore. And we'll touch on a few that do, a few aspects of the fair that do remain in a moment.
You hate to see it. You hate to see the old buildings go. But again, and I've said this in a few other episodes, not at all surprising. It seems like, especially in the 1800s, early 1900s, once every few decades, things were going up in smoke. It just seemed to be.
Well, and these things were not built to last even. Again, they cost a lot of money to put these on. So putting in these, a whole set of permanent buildings and pavilions all around this part of the city, oftentimes they plan to redevelop that part of the city after the fair as well. So it's largely by design that most of the fair structures don't remain. I think the first expo outside of Europe was the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. So this would be the centennial of the United States as a country. And the theme there was arts, manufacture, and products of the soil and mine. So that's about as industrial as it gets.
And I just can't get over the themes, the subtags or subtitles, whatever you want to call them, of these things. It's so wonky.
We almost could have done the episode just on the names. Yeah. I feel like we could have gone through them all. The next expo that was held outside of Europe and not in the United States was the 1880 Melbourne International Exposition, where the theme was arts. So that's new. Arts, manufacturing, agriculture, industrial products of all nations. So you start to see them leaning into the culture aspect a little bit more here. Let me highlight a few other locations. Again, I mentioned that certain European countries have hosted a bunch of these. In December 1949, the Exposition Internationale du Bicentenaire was held in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And the theme there was Festival of Peace. This was 1949.
Oh, that's nice.
We're just past World War II. And, it's interesting to think about each of these in world history context here for what maybe they're trying to promote. I mentioned Osaka, Japan had one, Progress for Harmony and Mankind. I think that was the first one in Asia, I believe. Again, some of these are not official, so aren't on certain lists. Expo 67 occurred in Montreal, Canada, which was Canada's first World Fair. The theme, how about this one? Man and His World.
Wow.
How's that for a wide open patriarchal theme?
That does not hold up well today.
Pretty stark, right? And that was in 67. It's not that long ago. In 2005, in Aichi, Japan, Nature's Wisdom, which I think is a step forward maybe from Man and His World. So that was in Japan. Beijing, China hosted an expo in 2010. And the theme was Better City, Better Life.
Oh, that's kind of nice. I like that.
And this is the time that China is really urbanizing, right? And really catalyzing a lot of urban growth and trying to create this huge consumer base within its own country. So it's maybe not surprising that theme was chosen for that particular time. The United Arab Emirates, Dubai, held Expo 2020, Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. I think I mentioned that one. And so these are some of the ones that have been happening. Try to give it a little bit of flavor of different parts of the world. But I want to shift our conversation now to iconic structures that were left behind from World's Fairs. And in most cases, they weren't necessarily even intended to remain, but they did. A lot of them weren't real popular in the home cities, but have become perhaps some of the most recognizable icons of that country, and in some cases, most recognizable landmarks of the world. The most famous of these will probably not come as a shock to you is the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, no, that is kind of a surprise. I did not know that.
It was made as...
Yeah, I had sort of heard that it's a giant radio tower, right? Or it was. I don't know if it still is, but I assumed that's what it was. That's what its purpose was. It was to be a giant radio tower to basically have a giant radio network.
Its function originally was to be a giant structure in Paris that would be awe-inspiring. So if you think, this is 984 feet tall, unless you include the antenna for the radio tower kind of situation, which would make it over 1,000 feet. But remember, this is before skyscrapers and everything. So this would have been a pretty impressive structure just in terms of size alone for Paris in 1889. Again, not a lot of critics thought that it was ugly, that it didn't represent Paris very well. It was open, it wasn't covered, but it remained and has now become perhaps one of the most recognizable landmarks, perhaps on the planet. Right? I
Yeah,
think
absolutely. It's up there.
that's
It's got to be.
certainly in the United States. This is well known. Yeah. So San Francisco hosted, I think, 3 of these World Fairs. They hosted one in 1915, which was called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. And the big theme was the inauguration of the Panama Canal, which was pretty transformative for a lot of aspects of politics, economics, and culture in the world. And so there's the Palace of the Fine Arts there. I don't know, near the Marina District. Are you familiar with that building at all?
Vaguely.
So there's a big Greek colony looking thing, Roman Greek kind of structure. And they had to reconstruct it. People actually ended up, I think, really liking this one. But, the original was made out of like plaster and chicken wire or something like that. And so they had to make something a little bit more permanent. But that is essentially a relic of the 1915 World's Fair. Here's one close to my heart because I lived in Brussels for a year, the Atomium. Have you ever heard of the Atomium before?
I think I've been there. It's like a giant atom structure. It's like this. Is that the thing I'm talking about?
That's the one. We've got to be talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I've been there.
This is a giant silver molecule thing, right? Yeah. That you can walk up into and stuff.
Yeah, it was kind of cool. I enjoyed it. It was better than, Brussels' other most famous thing, which is the mannequin piece, which is like super tiny.
Right, which is very small also. Yeah, so this was the 1958 Brussels World Fair. The theme was a worldview, a new humanism. So that's pretty high concept. And I think that was the first one held in Brussels, but like Antwerp had held one. There's been a few in Belgium overall. A little closer to home for you and I, or for you and me, the Space Needle from the 1962 Century 21 Exposition in Seattle. This is not referencing a real estate agency, but they're already in 1962, they're looking to the future. And this is the monorail was part of this situation. The Space Needle is 605 feet tall. It was built in just 8 months. And the whole themes are the sort of space age there. It's very sort of looks like maybe the Jetsons might hang out there or something like that. And so that was the vibe in the 60s. The context for this is that several years prior, I think maybe 4 years prior, 4 or 5 years, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik into space, right? This is the first human-made satellite. And so this is very much in context with the space race, which we have an episode on if you'd like to check that out.
We have a couple episodes on.
We've got 2 episodes on that because there's so much to say about it, because there's the way back version and there's the contemporary version. But this World's Fair figures very prominently in that whole situation. There's also something called the Unisphere, which seems redundant to me, frankly. I mean, a sphere, a duosphere, I don't know. A Unisphere from the 1964 New York's World Fair remains in Flushing Meadows, Queens. It's a giant replica of Earth, and I think iron or steel, perhaps it's steel this time. And it shows the topography of various countries. And there's a couple like Saturn-like rings like surrounding it for some reason as well, probably to symbolize some kind of dynamism or something. And then the last of these I'll mention is the China Pavilion from the Expo 2010 in Shanghai, which now serves as the China Art Museum. It is the largest art museum in Asia. This is the Better City, Better Life theme. And listen to this number. This particular World's Fair attracted 71 million attendants.
Oh, wow.
Which makes it
a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. And that ranks, I mean, it was somewhat recently, 2010, as the most attended World's Fair in history.
That's incredible. I wonder, I mean, we don't have these stats, but I would just be so curious, what's the internal versus, external sort of visitor numbers? Like, how is that?
That's a great question. I think my guess is for a lot of these, a lot of the visitors are local to the city. And then another large percentage are from that particular country. But then there's certainly international visitors, and there are probably a lot for this one. But yeah, that would be interesting to track that from time to time. And that would be an interesting geographical sort of study to conduct as well. So where are people coming from, and what was the attendance percentages of these things? So let's talk about something that's on a very dark side of the World Fairs. And this, I think, something that has to be mentioned and something that I wasn't fully aware of. But once I started researching, I realized it was a pretty big feature of a lot of World's Fairs from the late 1800s until approximately 1939. And this is where they had colonial sections, right? So colonialism was on display, and that was displayed very proudly. And people from colonized places were actually put on display at some of these fairs. So it's shocking to think about now. Of course, these are countries that participated in the transatlantic slave trade. So, shocking to hear about that, but probably pales in comparison to all this other stuff that went on. But again, a group of people, a government that would enslave people would probably have no problem putting people on display in a situation.
It's interesting.
It is very much meant.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about like the time that, especially some of these early ones, the 1800 ones, right? This was during a time of when African colonialization and Southeast Asian colonialization was probably at its peak. Maybe it's on its way to its peak, but it was becoming,
even before its peak, perhaps the first ones. Yeah.
But it was becoming a big part of all of these places' economy, right? That's how they,
That's right.
We look at places like, Paris, for example, and we're like, wow, this place is so beautiful and has so many like great buildings and everything. It's like, well, how was that, afforded? And it's like, well, because of all their colonies that they controlled. And so it makes so much sense that they would include sort of a colonial section, not right, but sense in that, because they were getting so much of their wealth and they wanted to show that off.
Right. And part of this is showing the superiority of white people, basically, by displaying people from other parts of the world in very sort of rudimentary kind of way. So oftentimes they were called native villages, which is again a pretty dated term, that were sometimes constructed by the very people on display. And oftentimes the people who were on display were forced to reside in the display area for the duration of the fair, which could be 6 months. And this display might include a few people, or it might include a couple hundred people. Clearly this is meant to impress in some way the white audiences that are there, and to also construct an other, right? So to suggest that progress means the way that we live, and here's the way that the world used to be, or something like that. And so, I'll mention a few of these specific instances of this happening. The 1883 International Colonial and Export Exposition in Amsterdam, which I don't think was one of the so-called official ones, very much is promoting the Netherlands as a colonial and commercial power. That's in the title. And so the fair included displays of reconstructed dwellings from places overseas that included indigenous people. And then in 1889, the Universal Exhibition in Paris had very extensive displays of this. And this became sort of the model that a lot of other cities wanted to follow, because this was apparently received pretty well by the public. It was well visited. And so the idea was to emulate that. The Brussels International Exposition in 1897. So I guess Brussels did have another one. The fair had a colonial section that focused on the Congo Free State. So the Congo Free State is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, is formerly known as Zaire. And at the time, it was the Congo Free State, but the Free State is a pretty big misnomer because it wasn't even a colony of Belgium at the time. It was considered to be the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. And the rule of the Belgians in the Congo was brutal, to say the least. Enslaved hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, forced them to produce rubber for the benefit of the wealth to enrich the king himself. And many hundreds of thousands or millions of Congolese died and were killed during this period of enslavement. So this is a way of really telling the world actually what's going on in sort of the darkest way possible, perhaps. At the expo, 60 people from Congo were forced to occupy a recreation of a Congolese village in a fenced-off area. 7 of these individuals died from influenza and pneumonia because they were left out in a really cold summer to experience these conditions. But, this happened in the United States as well, right? So these kinds of things happen in the United States. Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893 had 17 separate human displays that include Inuit and Native Americans as well. And this is during an exposition where African Americans were excluded from participating in the fair. And, it was thus forbidden for Black citizens to chronicle the Black African American experience in the United States because they weren't permitted to do that. And this perhaps reached its worst pinnacle in St. Louis in 1904, which is, and some of my research suggests this was the largest display of humans in world history for the benefit of another group of people. And the largest of these areas was an area that featuring people from the Philippines. And so the United States had just fought a war against Spain and taken control of the Philippines. So this is very much tied to that moment of U.S. imperialism. And then there were apparently individuals from 50 different Native American groups who were represented in a pretty harsh way. And not only that, but apparently in St. Louis 1904 Expo, the Battle of Little Bighorn was reenacted on a daily basis. So the Battle of Little Bighorn was when the U.S. federal troops went in to confront members of the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne, and famously the U.S. troops lost. But then this battle and this reenactment was made to portray Native American peoples as the aggressors when that wasn't the case, and to paint a very dark and negative picture of Native Americans. And so this is the kind of exhibition that sometimes went on in these world fairs.
It's really interesting sort of going through this, especially the part on the United States, because I think there's this idea that while the United States is generally thought of as a imperial, colonial sort of country unto itself, I think there's this idea that during the 1800s, when, colonization was sort of rampant for Europe, as they're, tackling South America and Africa and Asia, that the U.S. wasn't really a part of that. And the U.S. was just kind of like doing its own thing. But the reality is no, it was colonizing. Well, one, it was colonizing the areas that now, that are now considered to be the United States, right? The entire Western half of the country. But then bringing up Philippines as well, right? That was a country that was a colony of Spain and then immediately transferred into becoming a colony of the United States for a period of time until, it wasn't anymore. But it's just interesting thinking about this and oh yeah, the United States was right there with everybody.
Yeah. I mean, the partitioning of Africa, which happened over a period of 30 years, which was basically 7 different European countries carving up on a map a place they'd never experienced before. And that is an example of European colonialism. But of course, there were other countries in the world that were involved in that. And as you mentioned, the United States, and it still has colonies today. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, the U.S. Virgin Islands and Guam, Hawaii, for some people, we consider that, this is a place that used to be controlled by a different group of people for a long time and was taken over by a foreign power.
Yep.
And so, it's disturbing to think about this aspect of these fairs, but it's very much a reflection of the power and the way power is exercised politically at the time.
Well, I think with that, there's not really an easy way to segue off of that kind of topic.
No,
so instead, let's go ahead and jump to an ad break, give everybody a little bit of a palate cleanser.
And we'll return to talk about some more aspects of the World Fair when we get back.
Awesome. All right. So we will be right back.
Welcome back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about geography is world expositions or world's fairs. And you might be thinking, who runs this? Because I've been talking about officially sanctioned ones, and I was unclear on this until I looked into it a little bit more. But there is an entity called the Bureau International des Expositions, which is headquartered in France, as you might guess, in Paris. But the International Bureau of Expositions is how we say it in English. And this, since 1928, has been the international sanctioning body for these events. And not only does it sanction world fairs from that point forward, but it also seems to be the arbiter of what gets to be counted as a World Fair before 1928. So I'll give you an example of both something after 1928 that didn't get permission, and then one beforehand that for some reason isn't counted as a World Fair when it was a World Exposition.
Interesting. So this is kind of like FIFA or the IOC.
Yeah. It's, I mean, to put it in grim terms, it's like FIFA or the IOC, perhaps. Yeah. I don't know if I want to malign it quite that badly, but yeah, I think it's that kind of thing where there's a bidding process that goes on and an official stamp of approval to be sanctioned by this organization, which has a bunch of different countries that are members to it, but it's not the province of any one particular government. So there was a World Fair in New York in 1964, 1965. And there was a lot of grumbling between the president of this World Fair and the BIE. And the BIA said, listen, this is the way we do it. You can't have more than 6 months and call it a World Fair. Like we can't have these things go on any longer. And the president of the fair said, no, this has got to go on longer. I want this for 2 years. I want this to be a big commercial enterprise. We got to do this. And so the Expo president basically went rogue and said, we're going to do it anyways. Now, Geoff, can you guess for me who the president of the 1964-1965 New York Expo was?
I have no idea who this person could be. I'm guessing it's somebody relatively famous, at least within the U.S. history. Maybe like,
you know who this person is, and we've talked about this person on the podcast in more than one episode before. That person was Robert Moses.
Oh, no way! I mean, now not surprising, especially given the stance that Robert Moses took. And he was
maybe refresh our memories on Robert Moses a little bit.
Well, he controlled the New York parks, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
and a lot of the way that freeway expansion worked, and that sort of became a model for a lot of the rest of the country. And there's a lot of segregation of different groups of people happening through urban design. And this is all part of the legacy of this person who was also president of the New York World's Fair from 64 to 65.
Incredible.
He way overestimated the appeal of this fair and got a fraction of the attendees that he thought would come. A lot of countries were asked by the BIE to not attend and not provide pavilions. And so a lot of them didn't, and it just didn't really come off in the way that it was intended to. And the theme of that expo, incidentally, was peace and understanding.
I guess they couldn't come to an understanding about whether it's a World's Fair or not, but that's beside the point.
Apparently, the only other World's Fair that went a couple years was one in Chicago that began in 1935, the Century of Progress. So they felt they needed at least 2 years to represent a century. One note I want to make is about an expo that was held before this organization was even created. And this was one that was held in 1905 in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know this one. This is the Lewis and Clark Exposition, something like that.
Yeah, the full name of it was the Lewis and Clark Centennial and American Pacific Exposition and Oriental Fair. But it's usually just called the Lewis and Clark Expo. Not recognized by the BIE. I didn't really get a chance to dig too deeply into why that is. This is an expo that ran for 4 months, had exhibits from 21 countries, and had over 1.6 million visitors, which for Portland was pretty good, particularly at that time. And to give you a frame of reference, in 1905, Portland's population was 161,000 people. And in 1910, it was approximately 270,000 people.
Oh, so it had a boost. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the idea was, here's Portland. We're open for business. You should come live here. It's beautiful. That's very much the idea of holding this fair and then wrapping it around this Lewis and Clark anniversary. It was seen by civic leaders as an opportunity to, get people to move here, to attract business, but also to boost the reputation of Portland and illustrate that, Portland's a place that you should know about. It's a place that you should take notice of. The motto, get ready for the motto for the Lewis and Clark Expo. The theme was, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way."
Westward, the course of empire takes its way. What?
Yeah.
Would that ever mean, aside from, I guess, an empire moving westward and taking everything?
Right. That says it all, I think. And this was a name that was chosen, a theme that was chosen by the Oregon Historical Society at the time. I can assure you, the Oregon Historical Society today is emphasizing different things.
Yeah.
But at the time, that was the focus. The event was organized around an oxbow cutoff of the Willamette River called Guilds Lake. And apparently this was a pretty generous term to call it a lake because it was really largely marshlands, and they had to pump water from the Willamette back into this. And it was a pretty shallow lake, but this is where everything revolved around. There was an exhibit there that portrayed Filipinos in a very negative light along the lines that we talked about before. So I don't want to leave Portland out of that. Very racist descriptions and depictions of Native Americans were on display. But this is something that kind of launched Portland in some ways as to being, the idea was we have to find a way to rival some of the other big cities in the area and on the West Coast. Because God forbid that Seattle should become a bigger city than Portland, which
it did.
which happened pretty quickly after that, I think. And the forestry building from the expo remained until 1960. A fire destroyed it. Another fire.
You hate to see it.
However, they've reconstructed a forestry center there. So people who've been to Portland might know about that. And people from Portland probably know about that. We've got one more topic on World Fairs that I want to address here today, Geoff. And let's have a conversation about, and you alluded to it at the very beginning. Are these still things, are these going on still? Is this still happening? And I think for people in the US and perhaps Canada as well, there's not a lot of attention on this. There hasn't been a lot of hosting of this. So although it's still big in the world, it's not big in North America so much. The last World Expo in the United States, the last big one, was the Century 21 Exposition in Seattle. Man's life in the space age, incidentally, was the theme there. One of the functions of the fair was promoting U.S. power in the context of the Cold War. And, this is a time when the Soviet space program had enjoyed several successes, Sputnik. And so this is a response to that. Seattle previously had held the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909, which was a World's Fair. The last World Expo in the large incarnation of one in North America was the one in Montreal in 1967. And then the last specialized expo in the United States was 1984 in Louisiana. The theme was The World of Rivers, Fresh Water as a Source of Life. And just 2 years prior to that, Knoxville, Tennessee held one, the theme being Energy Turns the World. And the Sun Sphere, I believe, was the big structure there. Again, these are not as big as some of these other ones, but what I remember hearing about as a kid, it was the World's Fair, and I didn't know that was going to be different from any other World's Fair. The last World Fair held in North America was in 1986 in Vancouver, British Columbia, and the theme there was Transportation and Communication, World in Motion, World in Touch.
Oh, cool.
It's a very sort of globalization kind of theme.
Yeah.
So tell me, Geoff, why do you think there's less interest on the part of the United States, maybe the government or the people? Why do you think that this interest in World Fairs has waned?
I think there's a few different reasons as there usually are. I think the one that comes to my head first is, when a lot of these early fairs were going off, these World's Fairs, even into like the middle of the 1900s, there was a lot of desire, especially by, I think, U.S. cities, New York, Chicago, Seattle, LA probably had one, I don't know, to San Francisco, to showcase the United States for what it was, for what they wanted to be, which was, they wanted to be a superpower. They wanted to be this, they wanted to be that. I think as you head into post-World War II, the US was sort of, along with the Soviet Union, sort of the de facto world power. Europe was sort of in crumbles, right? It was being rebuilt. Japan was being rebuilt. And I just don't think there was that much. I don't think that there seemed to be a need for U.S. cities to do that, at least on an international scale. And I think what we see now is, the World's Fair is taking place in places like Doha or Beijing or other places in sort of Asia, because they're kind of having that moment, right? They're kind of having that moment where they are coming into a lot of wealth and prominence, and now they want to show off globally that, hey, we are international cities unto our own rights. We have an international culture. We have all of this stuff. Come see us. And I think that's and I think you would mention that Europe doesn't get a lot of them as well either.
Fewer than, I mean, it used to be they were mostly in Europe, and there's still some being held there. Like there's the smaller one coming up in Serbia coming up. But yeah, I mean, if you look at a list of these things, it's increasingly sort of moving towards Asia, and probably for a lot of the reasons you just described. I think in particular, if you notice that the last time we had these in North America were in the 80s, and the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 80s. And so once the Soviet Union was gone, the Cold War context for having these things was kind of eliminated. And then if you put on top of that, that all these other technologies started to be developed. And so you had, television, you eventually got satellite radio and communications, and the internet eventually comes along, and all of a sudden there's these other much less expensive ways perhaps than having a World's Fair of telling people about how great your country is and how it represents progress on the planet.
Right.
So I think that had a lot to do with it as well. The other thing is that there's the Olympics, right? Like that's
exactly
American people in the United States still glom onto the Olympics a lot. And so maybe that's taken its place a little bit in some ways. I don't know.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say that sporting events seem to have taken the prominence internally with, let's say something like the Super Bowl, a city internally hosting that, right? There's a lot of pomp and circumstance that goes into that event. And then internationally hosting something like the Olympics or the upcoming 2026 World Cup, which will be hosted by Mexico, the United States, and Canada, but a lot of those games are here in the United States. Something like that sort of takes that place, and undoubtedly that event will draw tens of millions of people to the country, minimum, right? So,
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other thing is that we've got some big theme parks in the country. I mean, other places in the world have these as well, but we've got some big Disney theme parks. In the 80s is also when Disney launched Epcot Center, which is experimental prototype community of tomorrow, which sounds like it could be a World's Fair. And Disney was involved in helping, not Disney himself, but the Disney company employees from it were involved in helping organize some of the design for some of the World Fairs that happened in the United States. And so that's maybe another reason why they've declined in interest, because we've got these permanent things that people can go and visit they want to see. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, though, and this comes back to our conversation we had at the very beginning about public diplomacy. There's an organization that used to exist in the United States called the USIA, which is the United States Information Agency. Are you at all familiar with this?
I am not at all. I have no idea what that is.
When I was an undergrad and I went to school in Washington, D.C., I learned a lot about this organization. And now I realize that the organization was disbanded in 1998. Oh. So it was an organization that is a U.S. government agency dedicated to public diplomacy that existed from 1953 to 1999. So very much tracking with the Cold War. And this was an effort for the United States to promote U.S. interests, U.S. perspectives on the world, and every other places in the world. So you've probably heard of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe.
Yep.
Those were operated by the USIA. When USIA was closed, what's not that the United States doesn't necessarily do those things anymore, but they were brought together under the realm of the Department of State. So instead of having separate divisions where these things were going on, the U.S. Department of State absorbed all of those responsibilities, and we didn't have a discrete agency that was exclusively charged with public diplomacy. So, yeah, I guess after the Cold War, the United States took less interest in this. And now a lot of the pavilions in other countries that feature the United States, they're not sponsored by the U.S. government, but rather they're bid out to different corporations to organize things. And so perhaps not an inaccurate depiction or representation of the United States that it's no longer the government running these things. It's different corporations. Now, having said all of that about U.S. disinterest, apparently Minneapolis and St. Paul bid for the 2023 Expo and didn't get it. Buenos Aires got it, didn't hold it. And then Bloomington, Minnesota, which is just south of Minneapolis, which is where the airport is, and the Mall of America, bid for the 2027 Expo that's going to be held in Belgrade. So there seems to be some rumblings, and I've seen some conversation that maybe there might be a new reason for having these things. And if it's going to be a little bit more focused on a real cultural exchange, not sort of a a colonial cultural depiction, that might be something that people could be interested in. There's a really great article by historian Grant Wong in Smithsonian Magazine that talks about the rise and fall of the World's Fairs. And so that's something I'd reference to listeners to check out as well.
Well, I think that's about it, Hunter.
There's a lot more to say, but we're not going to say any of it because I think we've reached the end of our broadcast allotment. And I hope that people found this interesting. Yes, they're still going on, and this is some of what the history and the contemporary scene is.
Absolutely fascinating. I love that Minnesota specifically seems to really want one. So I hope they get it. Right. Because Minneapolis is kind of a rad city. I don't know. Okay.
My parents are from Minneapolis, so I will just back you up that it's a good place. Yeah, it deserves attention.
All right, Hunter, you want to run through your pluggables?
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author with David Banas of Portland as a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And of course, co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. My name is Geoff Gibson, co-host of the podcast Geography is Everything that you're listening to right now. You can find me also over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Geoff. If you want more geography videos, whatever, go check it out. If you liked what you heard today, you thought it was really fun, please rate, review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. If you're watching this on YouTube, you got all these really fun visuals. Please like and subscribe. The video helps us, I guess, just get more subscribers so that more people can listen to this over there. It's really great. Really love it. Next week, we're going to tackle another sort of worldly topic, as we usually do, but it's going to be a very historical. In fact, we're going to go back farther than we've ever gone back before. Hunter, do you know what I'm talking about?
Is this the Pangea episode coming up?
Geography is Pangea, which is going to be...
That is going way back.
It's going way back. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to sort of track... I've sort of broken down to a few different pieces. I think it's going to be fun, where we're going to sort of track where we are today versus where we would have been if Pangea still existed. Should be a lot of fun. So come back next week, listen to that, and I guess that's it for today's episode. So thanks for listening, everyone.